Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden made his remarks on North Korea for the first time after being sworn in as president, affirming the necessity of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. How the Biden team will set the tone for the future talks with North Korea and what kind of reaction North Korea will make are being keenly watched. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining us is Markus Garlauskas, Senior Fellow of Asia Security Initiative at Scoutcraft Center of Atlantic Council. Mr. Garlauskas served in the U.S. government for nearly 20 years. Most recently, he worked as the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council from 2014 to 2020. Stephen Noerper also joins us today. Dr. Noerper is Senior Director for Policy at Korea and Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University. He also serves as a Senior Advisor to the United Nations Program on Northeast Asia. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Former President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed a broad statement in June 2018, which called for a firm and unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Garlauskas, with the new U.S. government shaping its strategy, will North Korea stick to its commitment?
Well, I think there's two key points here. And first of all, they committed to work toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which from the North Korean perspective has always been interpreted to mean not just North Korean denuclearization, but major steps by the United States and its allies to reduce the perceived or claimed threat to North Korea. So I think that's a big factor in terms of framing what they committed to. But I think the other element is that because of the events that took place at and after the Hanoi summit, Kim Jong-un has already claimed that the commitments that he made in 2018, that he no longer feels bound by them. So I think North Korea may emphasize the Singapore agreement when it's in their interests, but in the end, I don't think that they will necessarily feel like they have to remain particularly committed to it because they've already backed away, claiming that the U.S. has not lived up to its end.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Noerper, what is your thought on this?
Well, I might add that at the Party Congress, we saw a reference made to Singapore. So that seems to be an opportunity extended to the new U.S. administration to begin with the Singapore Declaration. And it seems that the instincts of the administration are in that direction. So that puts us on a good footing. Let's also remember that in that Singapore Declaration, preceding the denuclearization commitment was an agreement to a new relationship. And that's really a much more complicated issue that will include a lot of efforts to include denuclearization and beyond. But we heard in Secretary Blinken's confirmation that they're looking both at the security concerns and at the humanitarian concerns. And that too strikes a note of trying to take perhaps a more extensive or rounded take with North Korea on this, with denuclearization certainly the centerpiece.
Mm-hmm. In the recent Party Congress, Kim Jong-un re-emphasized his desire to strengthen nuclear weapons, and it raised doubts over the Kim regime's willingness to denuclearize. Dr. Noerper, does North Korea still want to talk?
Well, it seems that they both want to talk and continue to modernize. They don't feel any constraints on what they're doing by way of the modernization of weaponry. And the concern was we saw on display in Kim Il-sung Square apparently an even larger submarine-launched ballistic missile. If we think back to October 10th and the party anniversary parade, we saw longer range missile technology that was even greater. So they're continuing to develop, which again creates a necessity to get to talks at the table. He did talk about the U.S. as being number one enemy. He did mention the enhancements they're making in the nuclear sphere. He also said that they would meet force with force, but would also be open to meeting progress with some progress. So that could be deemed something of an olive branch for external consumption. And remember, a lot of the rallying around the military technology is also for internal legitimacy purposes to rally at home. So I think we need to take all of that into context.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Garlauskas, in the long term, will North Korea really give up its nuclear weapons?
I don't think we should give up when you say in the long term on the idea that North Korea would relinquish its nuclear weapons. However, I think for the foreseeable future, until there's a fundamental change in the calculus in Pyongyang, I do not think they'll give up nuclear weapons. And I think in particular right now, we are not on a path where they would consider giving them up.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any possibility that North Korea will reverse its commitment publicly?
Well, I think in many ways it already has reversed that commitment. When you look at the statements that Dr. Noerper mentioned at the Party Congress, the way they have reframed their commitment to denuclearization, it is essentially expecting conditions that are so far outside of what is feasible that they are essentially abrogating those commitments.
Right. Some North Korean watchers put out an analysis that North Korea wants to be recognized as a nuclear state. Dr. Noerper, doesn't this go against the regime's earlier commitment?
Well, I don't think, I think the issue is a broader one. The U.S. will not be recognizing, nor the international community, for that matter, North Korea as a nuclear state de jure. Whether they have to deal with North Korea as they have dealt with nuclear development in places like India and Pakistan, or as we think about Israel, it may be more like that, a bit more opaque. But the strategic goal remains denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. That was made clear by President Biden, both in the campaign and in the call you mentioned with the Japanese Prime Minister. And it's the stated objective in Seoul as well. It's just that we have perhaps an opportunity here to revisit some of this by way of emphasizing denuclearization and then bringing things like sanctions relief or other issues to the table. There is the implication that there would need to be some sorts of trade-offs on both sides, but the end goal remains the same. So not recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state at any point, but trying to get North Korea to realize that nuclear weapons don't provide its security. In fact, just the opposite. Its security is garnered and more guaranteed by the abandonment of nuclear weapons. And clearly, Kim needs economic rebuild and opportunity. That's why the Party Congress was moved up, and clearly that's top of his agenda.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Garlauskas, Dr. Noerper said that the U.S. government won't accept North Korea as a nuclear state. Do you agree with that view?
I agree that politically it's very unlikely, and given President Biden's comments and even his written commentary before he took office, I think it's clear that he wants to continue to work toward denuclearization and will not politically acknowledge North Korea or accept North Korea as a nuclear state. However, I think there's an increasing awareness and understanding that we have to acknowledge intellectually that North Korea is armed with nuclear weapons and does not plan to give them up. And I think that's important for a realistic, pragmatic strategy. And I think there are signs that the administration understands and that a broader group of experts understand that North Korea is nuclear armed and will remain so for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Then, Mr. Garlauskas, realistically, when is the earliest for the U.S. and North Korea to start talks?
Well, I think talks could actually start quite quickly if the preconditions could be agreed to and if the topic of the discussion could be agreed to. I don't expect North Korea to be interested in talks on denuclearization per se anytime soon, but I could see a scenario where other issues could be discussed and where some level of dialogue could be open just within a few weeks or months. But that depends on the Biden administration's interest in engaging in that sort of conversation. And I don't think at that point that's very clear. At this point, that's very clear.
Dr. Noerper, when do you expect the talks to happen?
Well, I think Markus's assessment is correct in that it's probably something where discussion of more incremental phasing or a step-by-step approach may be in the offing, and that might behoove both parties, especially given concerns about North Korean provocations. That said, there's a bit of a window. There's some space here in the sense that everyone knows the Biden administration has priorities at home by way of the pandemic, economic concerns, racial injustice, unity, and a very busy international agenda. So there's no doubt that there will be a great deal of attention continue to be focused on North Korea. But I think we have a few months' time for them to work through this. And I think both parties will want to come to the table with some results expectation, right? So a more pragmatic process, maybe a more multi-stage process, maybe a more comprehensive dialogue that does include some of these issues that Markus mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Garlauskas, if the talks indeed happen, will North Korea try to use its nuclear capability as a leverage? After all, they did show its latest SLBM in the parade that followed the Congress. How did you see it?
I do absolutely think that North Korea uses its advancing capabilities as leverage in negotiations and the threat of additional testing and additional progress. However, I think it's more than just leverage. I think they're advancing their capabilities for larger strategic purposes to improve their ability to not only deter, but also to coerce. And so I think they're not just leverage, they're not just bargaining chips, even though they could be used for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Noerper, what is your thought on assessment on North Korea's SLBM?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of concern. North Korea has continued to develop. Think of the lethality of the nuclear test as they developed from 2006 to the most recent in 2017, and the increase in yields. What they have done by way of highly enriched uranium technology and the centrifuges, where they have gone with the evolution of long-range ballistic missiles, the volleys we have seen this last year of short-range technology. They're able to produce and move quickly and create a more lethal danger. In terms of that, it is very critical to get to the table. So it will require looking at what is indeed an area of tremendous U.S. and international concern, and also to combine that with priorities established between Washington and Seoul as they return, as the U.S. administration has said, to a more appreciative alliance structure. And so doing that within Moon Jae-in's framework as well as President Biden's framework, and trying to approach this with some continued resolve, given the fact that that concern is very real. We've seen enhancements in submarines, and now we see enhancement, at least in terms of the length and the thrust associated with the submarine-launched ballistic missiles.
Meanwhile, President Biden mentioned North Korea for the first time as U.S. president when he had a phone call with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. He stressed the need to completely denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Dr. Noerper, can this be understood as Biden's strong will to get rid of North Korea's nuclear program?
Oh, I think certainly he remains committed to the idea of a nuclear-free peninsula, to full denuclearization of the peninsula. That is the stated U.S. and international objective. And in this particular call, too, to bring Japan in more closer to the process again, trilateral coordination and oversight is something that will enhance the process, trying to get our strong allies, South Korea and Japan, working together more closely again and with the United States on these areas of common concern, such as North Korea's nuclear and missile capability, and further off, China's rise and what we're dealing with in terms of a series of contentions across the South China Sea, the East China Sea, concerns about Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and others. So it's a very set of complicated Pacific relations, and that's why it's important that some of those named already as key players in the Biden administration be there, experienced, and really trying to approach these issues in comprehensive manners.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Garlauskas, what did you make out of what Biden said about North Korea?
So I also think that he wants to continue to work toward not only denuclearization, but it's worth noting he's mentioned a reunification of the Korean Peninsula as one of his goals. And so I think he will see the nuclear issue also in a larger context of changing the security environment in Northeast Asia in a positive way and working toward fundamental change. I think the nuclear issue is very important, but is also a symptom of a larger set of security problems that I think President Biden is well aware of.
Mm-hmm. And Biden's foreign diplomacy team is now almost put together. In the latest addition to the team, Wendy Sherman was picked as Deputy Secretary of State, and Jung Pak was named as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. From the Biden team's lineup, we get some indications that Biden's North Korean policy could be rather hawkish. Mr. Garlauskas, do you see it that way as well?
I don't really think hawkish is the right word. Jung worked for me for 2 years as Deputy NIO for North Korea. And I would characterize her as being very analytic and objective and pragmatic, serious person, not necessarily a hawk. So I don't think she will go into it overly optimistic, but at the same time, I don't think she's going to advocate for policies that are risky or reckless.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Dr. Noerper?
Oh, I think it's a very talented team, and I would expand beyond the personnel you've mentioned to include really Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan at the as National Security Advisor, Kurt Campbell as the Asia Coordinator, and then, of course, at State, working with Secretary Blinken, you do have Wendy Sherman, who has visited Pyongyang. And you have Sung Kim, a very experienced diplomat who is in as acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, and who has dealt very directly as one of our point people on North Korea and negotiated with North Korea. And then you have Jung Pak as well, very experienced with a lot of good instinct and solid time, both in public service as well as in the broader research and analytical community. So a lot of talent at the table to do just what Markus had mentioned in the earlier answer about Biden's objectives. Denuclearization, certainly, but also the idea of Korean unification and the idea of encouraging a stronger U.S.-ROK alliance as there's a rebuild and as we see really an underpinning that is reinforced now again on alliances. But the U.S. will also be asking more of allies. So some very talented people to guide the process forward.
Mm-hmm. And North Korea seems to be also setting up a new diplomatic team with the first Vice Foreign Minister, Choi Sun-hee, being demoted. Dr. Noerper, what should Biden's new team expect from North Korean counterparts?
Well, I think at this point, it's still a bit opaque. It's not 100% certain how things are settling in Pyongyang, nor has it really been since Hanoi and the dissatisfaction that the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un personally must have felt over the results of that process. North Korea certainly has been more inward looking with the pandemic. They have pulled down the blinds around the country, ostensibly for public health reasons. But it is very hard to see exactly where they're going. We know that the military has risen again, but under the party auspices. And the focus of this most recent meeting in January, the Eighth Party Congress, as well as the Supreme People's Assembly meeting that followed last Sunday, tend to emphasize the importance of the party. And so Kim Jong-un really reinforcing himself. In fact, it was the party title elevation that was one of the things that came out of it. So where we see his sister Kim Yo-jong in the process and where we see people like Madam Che coming out or not, I still think there's a bit left to be determined there. And when they reopen, when they re-extend it, maybe after the pandemic, but we'll try to certainly be focused on gathering certainty on their personnel. Just a bit unclear at this time.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Garlauskas, your view on this?
So I think there is often too much focus on the specifics of who the interlocutors are, and I think we need to look at the larger policy signs. And I think if we're going to look at leadership figures in North Korea to understand where they're going, a good example is Ri Pyong-chol, who is the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission of North Korea, sits on the presidium of the Politburo, and literally often is next to Kim Jong-un. And he used to be in charge of North Korea's missile testing. And I would say he's more someone to watch right now in terms of his rise over the last year and a half or so in particular. As a sign of where North Korea is headed. I think these moves of individual diplomats or people within the foreign ministry, I don't think that's really a key sign of where North Korea intends to go.
My last question today, both the United States and South Korea are ready with a new diplomatic team. How do you expect to see their cooperation?
Oh, I think we'll see a real commitment and uptick. And we're back to a process of a more regularized foreign policy. And I think with the professionals we've discussed alongside a new South Korean foreign minister and the rotation that Moon Jae-in has made among some of his national security decision makers, you will continue to see continued strong ties. And so, there'll be an issue on how to go or not relative to joint military exercises in the spring. Clearly, there will be a priority placed by the South Koreans on an earlier meeting with President Biden. So I would pay attention to that meeting. And the new relationship we may be looking at more is that of President Biden and President Moon, whereas the last few years we've been looking very closely at Chairman Kim and President Trump. So I fully expect that with these professionals in place, we're off to better things. And I think we can look with some very cautious optimism. The road is uphill and very difficult, but the talent at the table is very good, reliable, and experienced.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Garlauskas?
So I agree with all of that, and I'd also add, though, I think that there are some differences in both perspective and priorities between the Biden team and the Moon administration. However, I would emphasize, I think you're going to see from the Biden administration an effort to coordinate and work very closely together to treat South Korea as a valued partner. And I think in the end that those differences of perspective may actually in the end provide us two different approaches, two different angles to deal with North Korea that are complementary rather than conflicting.
There are some calls within the South Korean government that the U.S. and South Korea need to adjust flexibly the joint military exercise in March due to possible military tensions with North Korea, while many experts in the U.S. stress the combined military exercises are crucial. Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of Defense said it is committed to maintaining the readiness of American troops in South Korea through military exercises. We'll have to keep an eye on how the two allies will plan out the upcoming exercises. Mr. Garlauskas and Dr. Noerper, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Very much.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.